Well, fellow activist Keith Coleman was also detained in the then John Vorster Square police station, and he testified at the new inquest. He joins us now. Keith, thank you so much for joining us. You were detained by apartheid security police. You were 21 years old, and you were kept in solitary confinement for 52 days and interrogated, along with your cellmate at the time, or at some of the time, Dr. Neil Aggett, who later became a friend. And thank you so much for joining us. Can you take us back to 1982 and the 2nd and 10th floors of John Vorster Police Station, the most notorious of all torture centres in apartheid South Africa?
Certainly. Thanks for having me on the programme. It's a very sad day, the 5th of February 1982. I was in solitary confinement at the time, 3 cells down from Neil. There was sudden activity in all of the windows in my cell facing the corridor were closed, slammed shut. And we quickly found out that our fellow activist and friend Neil had died. I was in solitary confinement for a total of 155 days, but that day in particular stands out in my mind. We had spoken to Neil. Several of the detainees had managed to have contact with him, walking in the corridors or on the way to the shower or during a kind of an illicit conversation. And we'd heard from him firsthand about his torture. He had told me that he'd been assaulted. He had kept a shirt, a T-shirt, he said to me, which had blood on it, which he would hold on to prove that he was tortured. The shirt was never found, and we believe that the security police took that shirt away and probably did away with it, burned it or something. But Neil was very determined to prove that he was tortured. And over the next weeks when I'd seen him, he deteriorated as his torture got worse. And the last time I saw him, he was barely able to talk. He couldn't lift his head to greet me. And that was the last memory I have of Neil, is him in a really poor state as they tortured him worse and worse.
In that time that you were in solitary confinement, you described at the inquest, and I think in the book, how you slept on a blood-soaked mat, blood of other detainees, one presumed, that had been tortured. So torture was very much something that you all knew was taking place at John Vorster.
Absolutely. When I was first shown into the cell that I was put in by Captain Strivig, who I knew had tortured several of my friends, my fellow activists, I was really shocked. There was just a thin blanket on the floor. It was covered in blood. And that was my introduction to a cell. But in the subsequent 5 months, a number of times I saw detainees being carried back to their cells by security policemen, unable to walk. One of my fellow detainees had a broken rib from an assault, and I reported that to the medical officer. A number of my friends who I was detained with were tortured really, really badly. And I heard this firsthand from them while in detention. We managed to set up a way of communicating. And of course, afterwards, when we got out, we compared notes. And, you know, the torture was rife. There was a large swoop on around about 60 or 70 activists inside the country. And they were determined to prove a massive conspiracy, which was treasonous, which was furthering the aims of the ANC. And they would stop at nothing to get that. In fact, they failed. They got a few prosecutions out of it. Barbara Hogan was one of them. Cedric Mason, but he was actually never taken to trial. Alan Fine and a number of others. But in general, they failed in their purpose. And as they got more and more desperate to prove their case. So they resorted to more extreme torture. And Neil, unfortunately, fell victim to that. He was tortured really badly. And today we will find out from the magistrate, from the judge, whether that torture caused his death or whether, in his view, Neil killed himself to escape further torture, that it was induced suicide. So we are awaiting that finding today. Of course, Neil was he was the 51st person to die in detention. So it was a structural feature of apartheid that people were killed in detention, they were tortured to death, or they were tortured to the point of suicide.
Keith, there was an inquest held initially during apartheid, and it was regarded as an absolute sham. And that really, you said, was re-traumatizing for you. You were a banned individual, but you were allowed to testify. You were declared an unreliable witness. That inquest was another sort of re-traumatizing and painful experience.
Indeed it was. I mean, going to court as a banned person, sitting in front of the security policeman and Advocate Peter Gutierrez at the time, and being interrogated once again, and it was very, very intimidating. A number of us who were in detention with Neil testified about the treatment that he experienced, gave our evidence, and then we were all found to be unreliable witnesses by Peter Gutierrez. And yes, that was traumatizing. It was a very difficult thing to do. It took some guts to stand up in front of the security policemen who killed Neil and testify to their faces about what we knew. And then, of course, there was the cover-up by the apartheid magistrate. And I think that was the first pain for the family and for Neil's friends. The second one, actually, was when the cover-up perpetuated under a democratic government. And still, I'm very, very puzzled as to why it has taken 40 years before we have a second inquest, before there's an expose of the conditions which led up to Neil's death and the people who were responsible for it. The fact that the National Prosecuting Authority did not bring the case earlier, many, many years earlier. You've got to remember that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission recommended in 1998 that Neil's torturers be brought to justice, and that the torturers and killers in 300 other cases be prosecuted as well. And to date, none have, actually. So the cover-up continued. In a sense, the 1982 cover-up under apartheid was obvious. That's how that system worked. But the fact that that system was not replaced with something that was open and transparent and democratic is a source of puzzlement for me, particularly since a lot of the people who became ministers of justice and who became cabinet ministers were themselves victims of detention and torture.
Yeah, I mean, Ahmed Timmel's family say that there was a secret agreement. Other people say there's just inadequacy within the NPA's unit that was put to task with looking at these 300 cases that the TRC recommended be investigated. Quick last question before I let you go, Keith. I've often wondered, yes, you survived John Vorster Square and you survived torture and solitary confinement, but how did you live after that?
Well, you know, the people who were detained at the time, none of us think of ourselves as victims, actually. We were involved in the struggle. We knew the potential costs that we would have to pay. We're proud of what we did. We stood up to a system, and yes, we faced its brutal face in the torture cells and the interrogation chambers. But none of us see ourselves as victims. We won. We won the struggle for democracy, and therefore we're proud about what we've done, and that's how we live with the difficult periods and the things that we faced. I would just like to say one other thing, that it's difficult for us all to live with the lack of openness and transparency. That is really much harder in a sense than the experiences we had against apartheid. And you know, we fought for change. Neil Aggett fought for democracy. And that's about things being open, transparent, and accountable. And there needs to be accountability to the people. And the fact that if there was a deal, we don't know. The fact that these things can be done behind closed doors. If there is inadequate prosecution, we don't know. But that's not good enough. There needs to be an open and transparent account for why there was not prosecution. And, you know, the family and others are calling for a commission of inquiry as to why this is the case. Deals should not be done behind closed doors. If they were done, I don't know. But why this has been allowed to perpetrate should be questioned. And there should be a commission of inquiry into how 300 cases have not been brought.